Hello, everyone. I'm Amal, the External Debates Chair at the Imperial College Debating Society this year, and I'd like to welcome you to our first emergency debate of the term on the topic of vaccination. As vaccines demonstrate their effectiveness and gain approval, there seems to be light at the end of the COVID-19 tunnel. However, rising vaccine hesitancy means that this tunnel may be longer than expected. In view of this, the motion before the House this evening is this House supports mandatory vaccination for COVID-19. Whether you're joining us via Zoom or Facebook Live, we invite you to tell us what you think before by voting for or against the motion through the Google form, which we will post in the chat and in the discussion section of the event page on Facebook. After the debate, we are going to invite you to vote again to see how many people have changed their minds. In terms of the ground rules for the debate, we will have 4 speakers today, 2 for the proposition and 2 for the opposition, and each speaker will have up to 10 minutes to present their case. As usual, we will alternate from proposition to opposition. While we won't be doing points of information or floor speeches, we do invite you to send in questions via the Q&A form, which can also be found in the chat and on our Facebook page. And so without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Julian Savulescu. Professor Savulescu is a world leader in medical and practical ethics. He holds the Uhiro Chair in Practical Ethics at the University of Oxford, where he directs the Oxford Uhiro Center for Practical Ethics and the Wellcome Center for Ethics and Humanities. He's previously served as the editor of the Journal of Medical Ethics and is the founding editor of the Open Access Journal of Practical Ethics. Professor Savulescu, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Amal. So we're all familiar with the range of COVID-19 vaccines. We now have 3 candidates about to be licensed, 2 mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, and the Oxford adenovirus vaccine. The question arises whether these should be mandatory or not. And mandatory means that coercion is involved in their administration. Here is a basic set of principles around coercion. In any liberal state, such as the United States or the United Kingdom, the use of coercion or the limitation of people's freedom is only justified when there's a threat to other people. Harm to self is never a sufficient warrant for infringement of liberty. So to take an example, if a child goes to a school with toxic bleach or a gun in their possession, the risk of that gun or bleach harming others justifies removal of the gun. Infectious diseases are an example of lethal threat to other people. One person who can be asymptomatic can literally kill another through the passing on of something like COVID-19. It's on the basis of harm to others that forms of coercion such as lockdown, quarantine, isolation, and indeed mandatory vaccination can be justified. In COVID-19, there's another dimension. Time is lives. Every day around the world, 5,000 people die of COVID-19. So every day we delay getting to herd immunity, another 5,000 people die. And current estimates are that herd immunity requires somewhere between 60 and 80% of the population to be vaccinated. In the face of that urgency, not only to cover people, but to cover people quickly, we see that in the United States, up to half of the population say they wouldn't take a vaccine, and figures are similar around hesitancy in the UK. Only about 50% would be very likely or certainly to take a vaccine. So there are other coercive practices that we already accept. Conscription in war, taxation, seatbelts were initially opposed in the US, but now are accepted by people because they reduce the chance of death by 50% and also reduce the risk to other occupants. Many countries already have mandatory vaccination. In Australia, my former home, no jab, no pay means people don't get childcare benefits if they don't vaccinate their children. In Italy, there are fines, and in the US, children can't enter school without vaccination. Mandatory vaccination does not mean that people will be held down and forcibly vaccinated necessarily. It can mean withholding of benefits, fines, or prevention of school. Alberto Giubilini, who you'll hear from, and I have argued for what we call a collective duty of easy rescue. When the cost to an individual is small, but the benefit to a collective is large, we have a moral obligation to perform that act. And vaccination is an example of collective duty of easy rescue. However, other factors are also important in justifying a mandatory policy. And in this flowchart, I describe 4 major factors that would justify a mandatory vaccination policy. Firstly, that the problem is grave rather than minor. Secondly, that we have a high degree of confidence in vaccine safety and effectiveness. Thirdly, that mandatory vaccination is better than any alternative, particularly voluntary or incentivized vaccination. And lastly, that the costs associated with the mandate are proportionate to the gravity of the problem and the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine. So how are these conditions satisfied in COVID-19? Well, gravity of the problem, there have been over 1 million deaths, and in the UK, over 50,000 deaths so far. Also, the lockdown, which itself is exacting a large death toll, is required because of the failure to have immunity and herd immunity. One estimate puts 200,000 lives will be lost as a result of lockdown in the United Kingdom through a leaked government report. The infection fatality rate is still not clear. Estimates vary from 0.03% to 0.3 or 0.4%. Whether you consider that to be a grave enough emergency is a value judgment. There are some reasons to question that it's grave enough. The excess deaths in the UK are still the same as they were in 2008, but it's clear in some cases mandatory vaccination would be justified. If COVID was as lethal as Ebola, we would certainly have a mandatory vaccination policy. Safety issues. Well, the vaccines are said to be safe. However, this is the first time either an adenovirus or an mRNA vaccine has been introduced. It's been 10 years of research have been compressed into 1 year. And with any biological agent, there's always some risk of side effect. And many side effects with vaccines will only become apparent over a considerable period of time, over many tens or hundreds of thousands of people. So I think there are legitimate reasons to question whether the safety threshold with COVID-19 vaccines is crossed to justify mandatory vaccination, but we haven't yet seen the full safety data profile. We're told that over 25,000 people have already been assessed for the safety of the vaccine. Importantly, we have to compare mandatory vaccination to all possible other strategies or combinations, which can include contact tracing, selective isolation of the elderly, or indeed selective vaccination of the elderly in a mandatory way, and voluntary or incentivized vaccination. And lastly, we have to ensure that the penalties are proportionate, but these can range from withholding benefits or fines to the French have even mooted imprisonment. But for minor penalties, mandatory vaccination would be more justifiable. So I think there is a case for mandatory vaccination. Initially, there won't be enough vaccine to go around, but once there is sufficient vaccine, studies indicate that there's considerable hesitancy, particularly around concerns for safety, and time is lives when it comes to a lethal infectious disease. We need to protect the vulnerable. Some people with allergies, other medical illnesses, or other problems can't be vaccinated and require herd immunity to be established to protect them. In other cases, the elderly don't mount a strong immune response. For example, in influenza, like COVID-19, primarily a killer of elderly people, vaccination of children is the most effective way of reducing mortality because they are both super spreaders and the elderly are immunosenescent. They fail to produce an adequate response. And I've argued in favour of mandatory flu vaccination for children. Children don't appear to be super spreaders in COVID-19, and it appears as if the elderly do mount an immune response to the vaccines, but we have to wait until further evidence comes in relationship to spread and efficacy in different age groups. There's also great concern about how long immunity lasts, and if immunity is relatively short-lived, this will speak in favour of mandatory vaccination in order to achieve and maintain herd immunity. There's also geographical variation. So for many reasons, I think mandatory vaccination for COVID-19 could be justified, if not only to protect the lives of people from COVID-19, but also to enable the relaxation of the crippling lockdowns that themselves may be killing more people than COVID-19 and wreaking economic devastation that the next generation will have to bear for possibly decades. So whether the gravity of the problem itself is sufficient enough, certainly I think when you combine it with the only alternative being lockdowns in the United Kingdom, I think there's a strong case for mandatory vaccination. And if the vaccine is as safe and as effective as it's purported to be, and the costs associated with mandatory vaccination are relatively small, I think mandatory vaccination can be justified. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that speech, Professor Savulescu. Now, to open the case for the opposition, our next speaker is Dr. Paul Offit. Dr. Offit is a pediatrician specializing in infectious diseases and is a renowned expert in virology and vaccine development. He is the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine and currently serves as the director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He is also professor of vaccinology and pediatrics at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. Dr. Offit, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to do something I have never imagined myself doing in my life, which is arguing against mandatory vaccination, something I've taken the opposite position on always. But here with the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines, I'm going to make that case for two reasons. One, as Julian alluded to, just practical reasons. I mean, right now in the United States, with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, the messenger RNA vaccines, we have about 40 million doses for a 2-dose vaccine. That means we could immunize about 20 million people. Yesterday, the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices at the CDC said that the first tier group to get this vaccine are people who live or work in long-term care facilities or people who are essential healthcare workers. That's 24 million people to get a 2-dose vaccine. So we don't even have enough for that first tier. Then you get to the second tier. This is before you get to the general population. Then you get to the second tier, which involves other other essential workers like those who work in transportation, law enforcement, education, utilities. That's another 87 million people for a 2-dose vaccine. Still haven't gotten to the general population. Then you go to the third tier, the so-called 1C tier. That's people over 65 years of age who certainly are at high risk of dying from this disease when they catch it. That's another 53 million people. And then you have adults with high-risk medical conditions like obesity, diabetes, pulmonary disease, heart disease, which is another 100 million people. Now, there's a lot of overlap actually among those groups. I'm a person who's over 65, yet a healthcare worker, but it still adds up to about half of the adult American population to get a 2-dose vaccine, which is 300 million doses. Right now, it looks like we're only going to be able to make about 2 to 5 million doses a week. So it's going to be a long time before we have enough vaccine to be able to say that you have to get it. The second reason, again, Julian had alluded to this, is that this is a bat coronavirus that's just made its debut in the human population. It's been out for about a year, and it's already caused a number of clinical and pathological observations that one would have never predicted. I mean, it is a virus which can affect your taste and smell, meaning that it has the capacity actually to enter your brain. It is a virus that causes vasculitis, meaning inflammation of blood vessels, because every organ in your body has a blood supply, therefore all organs can be affected. What respiratory virus does this? This virus was billed as a winter respiratory virus, meaning a pneumonia-causing virus that was coming out of Wuhan. It is anything other than that. Because it can cause vasculitis, it can cause strokes, heart attacks, kidney disease, liver disease. Also, like all sort of viruses that, like this one, are sort of the envelope viruses spread by small droplets, it should be gone in the winter. I'm sorry, gone in the summer, much as flu is gone in the summer, but not this virus. It rages in hot and humid climates like Florida, California, Texas. It causes an unusual multi-system inflammatory disease in children called MIS-C disease. It causes a decrease in immunity in the sense that it can be immunosuppressive in men, particularly because it can cause you to make an antibody response against interferon, which is an important immune mediator. So this is just in the first year. So in the first year, you have this difficult to characterize elusive virus, which you are now about to meet with a series of vaccine strategies like messenger RNA or replication defective human adenoviruses or replication defective simian adenoviruses with which you have no clinical experience. What could possibly go wrong? I mean, I think it's fair to say that over the next 2 years, there is going to be a learning curve here, as is true with pretty much any medical innovation. I mean, there is not a medical innovation on the face of this earth that has not been associated with a human price. And I think that that's also going to be true here. So I think it is fair at least to wait until all of that has been settled out, which could take a year or two before we know that. And then with all that information is at hand, then I agree with Julian that it reasonably could be mandated, but not for a while. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Offit. Now, to continue the case for the proposition is our next speaker, Dr. Alberto Giubilini. Dr. Giubilini is an expert in bioethics and has published a book on the ethics of vaccination. He is a senior research fellow on the Oxford Martin Program on Collective Responsibility for Infectious Disease at the Oxford Uehiro Center for Practical Ethics. Dr. Giubilini, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to make an argument for mandatory vaccination, but with some qualifications in this case. So I'm generally very strongly in favor of mandatory vaccination, but maybe a bit less strongly in this case. So I'm going to state my case for mandatory vaccination more generally based on fairness considerations, and then I'm adding some qualifications specifically for the COVID-19 vaccine. So let me start with something that is not about vaccination, it's about other kinds of measures we have adopted in the last 9 months or so. So let's start with the lockdown that was introduced in March. So at some point at the beginning, so the measures were very, very restrictive. People were not allowed to go out. So I remember there was this kind of warnings from the government around Easter. So the lockdown started just before Easter. And there was this worry that people over Easter would go out and have picnics in the park, and that was not allowed. So there was this strong campaign by the government to please stay home, don't go out in the park. And you might think, well, but what happens if just a very few people go out in the park, enjoy, the nice weather that was? So there was nice weather over Easter, I remember. So it doesn't really make a difference, right? Because it's completely inconsequential. The problem only arises if too many people go out in the park and break the rules or the guidelines, whatever they were. So what is the reason why, say, your neighbor, so if you see your neighbor going out to the park when there are these guidelines in place to recommend people to stay home, so you will be probably a bit upset about that, and you will think, well, if they do that, why can't I do it as well? So it's completely inconsequential. Well, the problem is that if everyone starts thinking in those terms, then so you have what philosophers call this collective action problem, right? So that defeats the point. So we will be back with the park full of people, and so the virus will spread. But if only few people did that, then there would be no problem. And so this is a case that it can be compared to the case of vaccination in an important sense. So one might think, well, what if only few people were allowed to go out to the park, were allowed not to be vaccinated? So what's the problem? Another analogy that I often use in this case is that with taxation. So suppose that very few people refuse to pay taxes because it doesn't make a difference. If very few, so if I stopped paying my taxes today, it will make basically no difference to the economy of this country. If my neighbor does that, well, no difference as well. But if we start, too many people do that, then we start having a problem. But again, why shouldn't I be allowed not to pay my taxes if it doesn't make a difference? So in all these cases, what the ethical reasons for making your contribution to whatever public or collective good we can think of is fairness. So we want people to make their fair contribution to important public goods. And what I've argued is the same applies to vaccination and to whatever collective good or public good we want to achieve through vaccination. So normally, the collective good we want to achieve through vaccination is herd immunity, ideally. And if we think of the current situation, so I cannot think of any more important public good at the moment than herd immunity against COVID-19. So the same kind of argument applies. So Julian put forward an argument mainly based on considerations about harm. My argument is based more on considerations about fairness in the contribution that each individual has to make to very important public goods. After all, that applies to taxation, and it did apply to requirements not to go out, not to socialize during the stricter lockdown. So the same kind of argument applies. And there are two reasons why fairness matters a lot. First of all, well, because we do value fairness, as a matter of fact. So the reason why you would get upset if you found out that your neighbor didn't pay their taxes is because it would be unfair. So fairness has some intrinsic value. But also fairness has an important instrumental value, because fairness would allow to address the so-called problem of assurance. So the problem of assurance is a problem that arises because basically people are really not motivated to make their contribution to public goods, like herd immunity, for example, or whatever public good you want to promote through taxation, if they don't have enough reassurance that other people around them make the same contribution. Now, the best way to provide this assurance to people is through state coercion. That's the reason why we have coercion in the case of taxation. So we want everyone to pay their taxes simply because that, first of all, that contributes to the collective good, but also motivates each individual to make their own contribution. So if I find out that my neighbors went to the park, I will be upset and will think maybe I should go as well. So if I find out my neighbor doesn't pay their taxes, I feel less motivated to pay my taxes. And in all these cases, the role of coercion is precisely that of addressing the problem of reassurance. Now, to me, this is a very strong case for mandatory vaccination. So some level of state coercion to make sure that fairness is, so the fairness requirements are fulfilled, because fairness has both intrinsic and instrumental value. And then because that applies to many other cases, most notably taxation. Now, I've talked about herd immunity, but as the two speakers before me said, now herd immunity at the moment is a very unrealistic target, because we will have very limited availability of the vaccine for quite a long time. So the most pressing problem with the COVID-19 vaccine is to identify the groups to target first. So most countries, the guidelines of most countries at the moment seem to be that we should target those who are over 80 or over 85, especially those in care homes. So this might be questioned, but assuming that that's the target, so we want, say, all the vulnerable group immunized, so vaccinated, because that would, say, relieve the pressure on the healthcare system. So whichever good is feasible at the moment is not herd immunity, is, say, protecting the small fraction of the population, then the same argument about fairness applies in that case, because even in that case, each person has to make their fair contribution towards addressing the problem. So the problem we have now is that healthcare systems are overburdened. So then, well, if the way to address the problem is by vaccinating the most vulnerable, then these people have a moral obligation and also a legal obligation to be vaccinated. Also because, so the problem of assurance becomes even more visible in this case, because I've just heard, I don't know if you've heard like Boris Johnson's press conference, like half an hour ago before this meeting, and they say that if there will be if there won't be enough uptake of the vaccine, then these restrictive measures we are having will continue for longer. So the quicker people get vaccinated, the sooner we'll be able to release these measures. But at that, so if that's the argument, then we will have the problem that you will need to justify introducing restrictive measures for some people who are at low risk of vaccination in order to protect those at higher risk, simply because people at higher risk do not want to be vaccinated. So fairness will become an even more pressing problem, because it will be, I think, basically impossible to justify restrictive measures when we have a vaccine that some people refuse to take. So in this case, I think the case for mandatory vaccination based on fairness is stronger, but it's limited to a smaller group of people. So we cannot aim at vaccinating all people. We cannot aim at herd immunity. So there is no point in making, I agree on that, there is no point in making vaccination mandatory for the whole population at the moment. But whichever group we identify, I think vaccination should be mandatory. I think it was 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, thank you for that speech, Dr. Giubilini. Now, to continue the case for the opposition is our next speaker, Dr. Richard Pinder. Dr. Pinder is a consultant public health physician and director of undergraduate public health education at Imperial College London. He acts as an advisor on a range of population health topics, from health policy and management to pharmaceutical medicine. Dr. Pinder, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and it's a privilege to be on a panel with such distinguished speakers. I feel like the odd one out here. My job is as a public health doctor, and I've spent the last 10 months working in local public health in South London, trying to improve our response to coronavirus. So what I'm going to be talking about is very much seen through the lens of perhaps not quite the ethical rigor of some of my previous esteemed speakers, who actually make very reasonable arguments, I think, on the basis of mandatory vaccination, but is based very much in the implementation side and the challenges that I've observed over these last 10 months, trying to get anything done pretty much, particularly when it comes to penalties and trying to enforce things. But I want to say two things, first of all. The first is that vaccines are really important. And if you're against mandatory vaccination, it doesn't make you against vaccines. And I think we've heard very clearly, particularly from Professor Savulescu so far, around the benefits of the vaccines in this context. They are the second most important public health intervention after water, sanitation and hygiene, and their value is huge. And so whatever I say this afternoon is not against vaccines in principle. But the second point I want to make is the fact that government relies on consensus. The ability to govern is based on the idea that those of us who are governed accept that responsibility. And whilst we can certainly disagree, we eventually do have to put our divisions aside and take a consensual approach to how things are progressed. And I want to give you three reasons as to why mandatory vaccination in context of COVID-19, but I would argue actually in almost all infections would be, first of all, wrong, second of all, unenforceable, and third, potentially self-defeating. Now, I'm not going to win an ethical argument against the brains on the panel here on the theoretical ethics, I have no doubt. But I think most of us would accept that in a Western liberal democracy, we would accept the basis that people have responsibility and accountability for their body. And the idea of injecting a pharmaceutical agent into an individual against their wishes, I think, is not what we would wish. It is not what we would want. And I suspect for many of us as healthcare professionals, it is not what we would do. Now, there are legal safeguards, of course, to protect people from common assault. Of course, all legal matters are potentially disputable by passing new laws, but the extent to which they go against the very basis the very basic principles of our society, I think is an important one. And I think what this does is potentially set a very unnerving precedent as to what else the state might be able to do to compel people to take a course of action that at face value would certainly have sort of macro benefits to society, but which subjugates individual freedom of choice. And I would certainly be against anything that forced people to do something that they didn't want to do. Now, my second point is that it is unenforceable. And the ability to enforce an action is absolutely critical when it gets out into the implementation stage. We have instructed, certainly in this country, I know those of several panel members are from other countries, but certainly in this country, we have created all sorts of new regulations, guidelines, laws. We have confused the public beyond measure to the extent that certainly even people such as myself, who spend all day and potentially all night dealing with COVID regulations, really do struggle to understand even what it is we're meant to be doing at the moment, let alone what is actually lawful. And the challenge we have, for example, I'll give you the example of isolation payments that I've been trying to implement around isolation. So when someone tests positive and they have contacts, we do have the ability to compel people to stay at home. There's absolutely no way that I can enforce that. Okay, there is no system, there are no people out there who are going to monitor the risk, there is no system to connect all that information, and there is no clear penalty or appropriate punishment which we can actually lever in that direction. How would we know? There would always be exemptions. There will always be people, which I think all panelists would accept, who would be exempt from a mandatory vaccination strategy. And if you look around any supermarket, I would suggest for all of you, there are people who are not wearing face coverings. There are not people not wearing face coverings on transport systems. We have no means of establishing whether that is a justified exemption or someone literally flouting the rules. The ability to enforce this is deeply problematic. But my third point is that it is ultimately self-defeating. And it is self-defeating because people are innately suspicious of vaccines. People are innately suspicious of government. And we see that particularly in such a divisive way in the United States at the moment. But by making this compulsory, we pour fuel on the fire of conspiracy theorists. And I think this is particularly risky, because then what happens to every single other vaccination? Those vaccinations somehow aren't as important. Well, does that make it somehow less likely that people are going to be vaccinated against anything else? And whilst all of our efforts right now might be focused on COVID, of course, there are other vaccines, there are other infections. They're not vaccines, there are other infections right around the corner that we're also trying to combat. Measles would be one example in this country, but polio would be another example elsewhere. So my belief is that this is fundamentally wrong. It is fundamentally unenforceable, and it is potentially self-defeating for the future. And what we have to have one eye on in all of these circumstances to consider, well, okay, this might get us through this first hurdle. Where does it leave us after all of this? And a more divided, a more conspiratorial, a more suspicious, a more observed society is certainly not one that I wish to live in the future. Now, I would just take on one point that I think Professor Giubilini made around the risk versus benefit. When I look around and I deal with patients and we talk about vaccination, it is those patients who potentially suffer the greatest risk who are potentially the most likely to accept and pursue the vaccine. And it is my belief that certainly acknowledging all of the risks that we've talked around in terms of speed and volumes and availability of vaccine, I do believe that those people who are at greatest risk will have the greatest motivation to pursue the vaccination, and therefore will be conferred the greatest advantage by a voluntary vaccination scheme. So I think that idea of risk versus benefit is a really important one for us to follow. Now, Professor Offit has made the point around this issue to do with scale and rollout. I think for all of us who are dealing on a policy level with all of this at the moment, it is looking very much more positive. There is some light at the end of the tunnel, but we have no idea how long the tunnel is, and we have no idea what is the other side of the tunnel in terms of what things look like later. This is going to be a long march. We are not going to be suddenly out of the woods by March, as perhaps has been suggested elsewhere. But I totally accept, and I would support the point that Professor Offit makes around the fact this is not the time to do it. And I think that's an important point. There is all the complexity, as he points out, about the vaccine itself. But before I leave you, I do want to offer some more constructive suggestions as to how we go on. I think there is a justification well, I think, first of all, I think we need to take the view of solidarity and altruism. And it's solidarity and altruism that has got us through the vaccine trials. It is solidarity and altruism that will get us back to a more normal way of life. And we shouldn't be going down the line of coercing people into doing this. We should be pushing the line that we are stronger together. And that is a really important principle. Coercion should be avoided, but I would countenance nudges. I think there are certainly circumstances where it may be justifiable, for example, to say you're not allowed on an aeroplane because you do potentially subject other people to additional risk. We're not forcing you to go on an aeroplane. That is of your own volition, and I think individuals must consider the risk versus benefits under those circumstances. I don't necessarily even rule out mandatory vaccination in the future. I think I'm with Professor Offit on that. But I think there are far more graduated steps that we should take, and only once, as Professor Offit says, only once that time comes where we have ruled out every single other possible option in front of us, and potentially where there is enough supply and the people to actually do it, then I think it's not something we would rule out. And I think it would be silly to take any option purely off the table. But for now, I leave you with the 3 points. Mandatory vaccination is wrong, it is unenforceable, and it is ultimately self-defeating.
Thank you, Dr. Pinder, and that concludes the debate. We now invite you to vote again for or against the motion, and we'll publish the results on our Facebook page subsequent to the event. Now we will proceed to a short question and answer session. Joining me for that is our secretary, Camilla Cutilla. For the question and answer session, we select from the questions that you have submitted through the question and answer form. Speakers are requested to please respond in under a minute so that we are able to get through as many as possible. We will now be going to our first question. Camilla.
Thank you, Mo. Yes, our first question is for all the panelists, and is, can I ask if you have an opinion on whether countries should focus on vaccinating their own population first, or do they also have an obligation to make that vaccine available to disadvantaged countries?
So what order do you want us to go in?
Yeah, maybe.
It doesn't matter, whoever wants to go first.
Okay, I will go first if that's okay, just because break the silence. So this is an important question. So there is this debate between what's called the vaccine nationalism versus globalism. I think all governments need to have a mixed strategy. So worry about both things. So vaccinating their own population, but also contributing to the global effort of vaccinating people around the globe. That's not just for altruistic reasons, but because it's in everyone's interest to make sure that people are vaccinated everywhere in the world, because infectious diseases know no border. So it is, for example, it is in the interest of the UK that people say in Africa, South Asia, South America are vaccinated. So there are both altruistic but also self-interest reasons to pursue both strategy. And the big challenge is to find the right balance between national interest and global interest.
So, I mean, I'll just say that this is just a very general problem of self-interest versus morality, or in this case, national self-interest versus morality. We may do a lot more good by distributing vaccines to poorer countries with less medical infrastructure, no dexamethasone or remdesivir or monoclonal antibodies or intensive care units. So it's just a question of what are your obligations to your population's health versus to other countries' health, and that applies every day outside of COVID. So what answer you give to that, you should apply to COVID. The reality is that countries are hugely more concerned about their own national self-interest than they are about other countries' welfare, even when they can do more good in other countries with the same amount of money. So I can't see in reality that the US will put aside its own citizens for the sake of people in Africa.
Yeah, I would say this. I think, you know, I live in the United States, which is, in theory, is a technologically and economically advantaged country. And the fact of the matter is, what we've learned over this past year is that this virus doesn't recognize country borders. We are essentially all one country, and what happens in one part of the world affects what happens in the other part of the world. So I think we have to have a dual strategy where we vaccinate not only ourselves, but to the degree that we can, vaccinate the world. The good thing about the messenger RNA strategy, when you think about it, is that take Pfizer's vaccine, it's a 30 micrograms per dose vaccine. A microgram is a millionth of a gram, a millionth of a gram. You can make kilograms of this stuff, meaning thousands of grams. I mean, you can make enough vaccine to vaccinate the world. You can. I mean, that's the advantage of the mRNA strategy. We'll see how it plays out. But I think the general answer is, what worries me the most about this is that the vaccine will be used for the purposes of advancing nationalism. You know, that countries will provide vaccine to their allies, but not to their enemies, when in fact, we're all one here.
I think we've got consensus breaking out. I would agree with everything that the rest of the panel has said on this. I think it'll be a brave politician who decides to vaccinate other countries firstly.
All right, thank you for those responses. Our next question is, what do you think the effects of making this vaccination mandatory could be on vaccine hesitancy in the future?
Sorry, can I ask you if you can repeat? I think you're too far from the microphone because I couldn't hear. I don't know if others are. Yeah, thanks.
So our next question is, what do you think the effects of making this vaccination mandatory could be on vaccine hesitancy in the future?
Well, so I think we need to sort of get rid of some bad arguments in the spirit of debate and concentrate on the main argument. And it's a mistake, first of all, to think that mandatory vaccination must be forcible vaccination. Mandatory means attaching a cost to not being vaccinated, and that can be a fine, or it can be preventing a child going to school, or it can be removal of a financial benefit. So when Dr. Pinder says it's unenforceable, that's just wrong. It has been enforced in Italy, and it does increase the vaccination rate. It has been enforced in Australia and the US, and it does increase in vaccination rates. It is enforceable. It requires, issuing a fine, and if you don't want to get vaccinated, you pay the fine. That's what happens with seatbelts, which are also mandatory. Nobody goes around putting on your seatbelt. The real issue is around safety, as Dr. Offit has said. And if the vaccine does have risks, a mandatory policy will create very bad effects of vaccination in general and vaccine hesitancy. If it's safe, it could be implemented just as other mandatory policies have been. But the real issue is safety in this debate. And I agree with Dr. Offit. I think that there are real issues that need to be addressed. But if the vaccine is safe, it can be treated just as other safe vaccines are, and it can be implemented. Yeah, it doesn't increase hesitancy. I mean, there is always going to be 5 or 10% of people who are hesitant, but a lot of people are just there, and it's easy or difficult to get vaccinated. But if you attach a cost, they will.
Yeah, I deal with the anti-vaccine movement in the United States all the time. They particularly hate me, by the way, which you're welcome to see if you just Google my name. But, I think that sometimes you have to compel people to do the right thing. I mean, if you look in the United States, there are 2 states that have essentially mandatory vaccination, which are Mississippi and West Virginia. Not the states you would necessarily pick. I mean, not states necessarily known for their public health achievements. Those 2 states have the highest vaccination rate in the United States. Because as Julian said, there is a pop-off valve, which is that you're not pinned down and forced to get a vaccine whether you want it or not. You don't get to go to the school you want to go to. You're going to have to homeschool, which is an emotional burden and an economic burden. And it's hard for people to do. So if you want to be part of society, you want to go to public school, even private school, in those 2 states, you have to be vaccinated. Now, because of outbreaks, there have been 3 more states now that have eliminated any sort of philosophical or religious exemptions to vaccines: New York, Maine, and California. So we're getting there. I think we're moving toward mandatory vaccination without a pop-off valve. And I think what happens is you see an increase in vaccination rates. Sometimes you have to compel people to do the right thing. I think that's fine.
Yeah, I completely agree on that. So I've often made exactly this point. So I didn't understand why Dr. Pinder said that it's not enforceable, because it has been enforced. So in Italy, there is a 500 euros fine on children who don't get the measles vaccine. It worked well. So I think Dr. Pinder was making another point that no matter what kind of policy you implement, there will be people who get away with non-vaccination. So, but that's true for taxation as well. So that's not a reason against mandatory policy. It's not that we don't make a taxation non-mandatory because people evade taxes. So I think that's a different issue. So you will not be able to vaccinate everyone, but that's not. And to go back to the specific question about hesitancy, I think the best way to show people that vaccines work, that are safe and effective, is not with words or rhetoric, it's with facts. So Julian used at the beginning the very useful analogy of seatbelts. So at the beginning of the 90s, when seatbelt requirements were introduced, many people were skeptical. And part of the reasons were that many people were afraid that sometimes seatbelts can cause actually harm, which they do in very rare cases. But what we saw with facts, not with rhetoric, not with fostering trust, not with campaigns, with facts, that over 20 years, deaths from car accidents have dramatically reduced. So once people see with facts that vaccines do work, I cannot see of a better argument against hesitancy or against the anti-vaxxers than showing in facts that vaccines will, say, reduce the burden of COVID-19 or measles, which it's doing, for example.
So to have the right to reply here, I think, again, in the spirit of debate, I think it's quite a different thing to compare vaccination in a school where there are registers and we know who the children are and we can actually track them down, to suggesting a societal level approach where we can't govern, we don't know who people are, where there will be incredible motivations to circumvent the system through black market, counterfeit, all sorts of other records. And I think that's a particular concern here, but I'd be very interested to hear any counter arguments to that. In terms of the hesitancy issue, I think that the main concern for me is that I think 20 years ago, well, actually that's probably a bad example, but historically, if we were able to prove in 10 years' time that this vaccine is beyond reproach and is totally safe, that would be brilliant. But I am not convinced that even if we do manage to prove that, at least on the science side, that will be the message that will be received by the more cynical, conspiratorial believers in the anti-vaxxer movement, who are increasingly influential and where we've seen social media can spread these rumors. So I think we're actually sort of, we sort of have to work uphill on this one, because everything is against us in terms of getting that science and that positive message out.
Thank you very much for all of your answers. Our next question is there a concern over resistant or mutated strains of COVID-19 in the future if the vaccine is optional?
I can answer that question. I mean, so it's a single-stranded RNA virus, so it mutates with every cycle of replication, much like flu is a single-stranded RNA virus or measles is a single-stranded RNA virus. The question is, which one is it going to be most like? I mean, flu mutates so much from one year to the next that you need to give a yearly vaccine. Measles has been, the vaccine was introduced in this country in 1963 and has not in any sense mutated away from the vaccine. So I think, and measles has been used, initially sporadically, then we eliminated measles from this country, then because a critical number of parents chose not to vaccinate their children because of false beliefs about the vaccine. Imported from England, by the way. Thank you, Andrew Wakefield. Thanks for sending them here, by the way. Really appreciate that. First it was the tea tax, then it was this, but I think that that at least one wouldn't imagine that intermittent use would create a mutation that was critical enough to be distinct from the vaccine. It's certainly not the measles story, so I don't think so.
Can I ask Dr. Offit a question? He raised this interesting issue of some concerns about the vaccines, and I was wondering if you could just elaborate on what theoretical concerns you might have with an adenovirus vaccine or with the carrier media that are used with mRNA vaccines. I mean, obviously these are new vaccines which have never been used before, but what might give you some cause for concern?
So I'll be honest with you. I mean, the UK vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is a replication-defective simian adenovirus, has had 2 clinical holds. One was for so-called undiagnosed multiple sclerosis. The second was transverse myelitis. The feeling by the UK regulators was that these were coincidental and not causal associations, although it's hard to prove that. That was their feeling. What's a little worrisome is that both of those processes have similar pathogenesis, which is to say antibodies or T cells directed against myelin basic protein, which is the protein that sort of is associated with the sheathing of nerves. And the Johnson & Johnson product, another replication-defective adenovirus, also had a clinical hold. Now, time will tell. What worried me the most about that transverse myelitis case, multiple sclerosis is relatively common, but transverse myelitis, it has a background rate. Transverse myelitis is just inflammation of the segment of the spinal cord. The background rate of transverse myelitis is 1 per 200,000. That was seen in the first 9,000 vaccinees. Statistically, it's possible. It's just odd. So, you just have to be open-minded. I mean, my own person. I'm the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine. When our vaccine was released in 2006, but there was a rotavirus vaccine that came onto the market in 1999. That virus had been studied for 50 years. I mean, as an animal pathogen, as a human pathogen, 50 years. And when it caused this intestinal blockage called intussusception, that was a surprise to everyone. That was a sobering experience. I mean, it wasn't seen with animal strain or in humans. And here, after 50 years of study, it's rare, but it was a real phenomenon occurring in about 1 in 10,000, 1 in 30,000 children, and it caused 1 death. So I guess I'm humbled. I'm humbled by nature. I think nature gives its secrets up slowly and grudgingly, and often with a human price. And so I'm sure there are things we don't know, and I'm just trying to be humble in that.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Our last question is, how can governments limit the possibility of public unrest that might arise from a vaccine mandate, given the widespread hesitancy to vaccination?
I would say that will be easier than manage the unrest that has been caused and is going to be caused by measures like lockdown or social distancing or quarantine requirements, which are causing increasingly more often unrest and protests. So that these are getting bigger. So if you're not, because that's the alternative scenario. So we always have to think that the alternative scenario to people getting vaccinated is other kinds of restrictions and infringements of people's liberty, most notably keeping people locked inside their homes for months. So I cannot think that it's more difficult to manage the unrest caused by vaccination than it is to manage the unrest caused by, say, lockdown, for example. Yeah.
So again, you want to move in a staged way, and one very reasonable alternative to vaccination is isolation, because then you're not a risk to other people. So it would be very reasonable for governments to grant greater freedoms to people who are vaccinated, so-called immunity or vaccination passports that enable greater travel on aeroplanes or access or freedom of association or movement. And that's a reasonable cost, a cost that we're all paying now in blanket lockdown. And so again, Richard's point that not allowing you to travel is a nudge, that's not correct. That's coercion, because it's removing an option for people to travel unvaccinated. So that's technically coercion. That's technically a form of mandate. And so those sorts of options may be acceptable, particularly in the light of the fact that they've already been used on people through the last 9 months. So I think you have to start with small, more acceptable ways of changing behaviour. And as Richard said, if you don't want to get vaccinated, pay the price. Don't get on the plane. Don't have to. You might have to wear a face mask, or you might not be able to go to the pub and drink, or whatever it is the cost is you're associating with it. So I think in this debate, there is just this mantra that we can do it through solidarity, through altruism. And maybe that's true and that's great, and this is a moot debate. Likewise, if there's not enough vaccine, moot debate. except along Alberto's lines, we should mandate it for certain groups. But what's really interesting is actually looking at different possibilities and which one we should explore. And I think mandatory, and I've also argued in favour of paying people to be vaccinated. I think we should be looking at altruism, mandates, payment, everything, and actually studying them to see which one works the best. And I don't know from this armchair which one works the best. It might be mandatory, it might be payment, it might be altruism. But unless we look, we won't find.
All right. Thank you so much for that, for all those responses. That concludes our question and answer session. I want to thank all of our distinguished speakers for joining us today. We know you're very busy people, especially during a pandemic. And we also would like to thank all of our attendees for tuning in this evening. We hope that you enjoyed our emergency debate and hope to see you at future events. Don't forget to vote again for or against the motion through the link that we've posted. And you can join our mailing list and membership through the links on the Facebook page as well. Thank you very much, and good evening